Hello, everyone, and welcome to the conclusion of the narrative of Mary Jemison. I will read to you the final two chapters of the narrative, beginning with chapter 14. Micah Brooks, Esquire, volunteers to get the title to her land confirmed to herself. She is naturalized. Great Council of Chiefs in September 1823. She disposes of her reservation, reserves a tract 2 miles long and 1 mile wide, the consideration and how paid. In 1816, Micah Brooks, Esquire, of Bloomfield, Ontario County, was recommended to me, as it was said, by a Mr. Ingalls to be a man of candor, honesty, and integrity, who would by no means cheat me out of a cent. Mr. Brooks soon after came to my house and informed me that he was disposed to assist me in regard to my land by procuring a legislative act that would invest me with the full power to dispose of it for my own benefit and give as ample a title as could be given by any citizen of the state. He observed that as it was then situated, it was but of little value, because it was not in my power to dispose of it, let my necessities be ever so great. He then proposed to take the agency of the business upon himself and to get the title of 1/2 of my reservation vested in me personally, upon the condition that, as a reward for his services, I would give him the other half. I sent out for my son John, who, on being consulted, objected to my going into any bargain with Mr. Brooks, without the advice and consent of Mr. Thomas Clute, who then lived on my land and near me. Mr. Clute was accordingly called on, to whom Mr. Brooks repeated his former statement and added that he would get an act passed in the Congress of these United States that would invest me with all the rights and immunities of a citizen, so far as it is respected my property. Mr. Clute, suspecting that some plan was in operation that would deprive me of my possessions, advised me to have nothing to say on the subject to Mr. Brooks till I had seen Esquire Clute of Squawky Hill. Soon after, this Thomas Clute saw Esquire Clute, who informed him that the petition for my naturalization would be presented to the legislature of this state instead of being sent to Congress, and that the object would succeed to his and my satisfaction. Mr. Clute then observed to his brother, Esquire Clute, that as the sale of Indian lands, which had been reserved, belonged exclusively to the United States, an act of the legislature of New York could have no effect in securing to me a title to my reservation or in depriving me of my property. They finally agreed that I should sign a petition to Congress praying for my naturalization and for the confirmation of the title of my land to me, my heirs, etc. Mr. Brooks came with the petition. I signed it, and it was witnessed by Thomas Clute and 2 others, and then returned to Mr. Brooks, who presented it to the legislature of this state at its session in the winter of 1816 to 1817. On the 19th of April, 1817, an act was passed for my naturalization and ratifying and confirming the title of my land agreeable to the tenor of the petition, which act Mr. Brooks presented to me on the 1st day of May following. Thomas Clute, having examined the law, told me that it would probably answer, though it was not according to the agreement made by Mr. Brooks and Esquire Clute and himself for me. I then executed to Micah Brooks and Jellis Clute a deed of all my land lying east of the picket line on the Gardow Reservation, containing about 7,000 acres. It is proper in this place to observe, in relation to Mr. Thomas Clute, that my son John, a few months before his death, advised me to take him for my guardian, as I had become old and incapable of managing my property, and to compensate him for his trouble by giving him a lot of land on the west side of my reservation, where he should choose it. I accordingly took my son's advice, and Mr. Clute has ever since been faithful and honest in all of his advice and dealings with me and for myself and family. In the month of August 1817, Mr. Brooks and Esquire Clute again came to me with a request that I would give them a lease of the land which I had already deeded to them, together with the other part of my reservation, accepting and reserving to myself only about 4,000 acres. At this time, I informed Thomas Clute of what John had advised and recommended that I do, and that I had consulted my daughters on the subject, who had approved of the measure. He readily agreed to assist me, whereupon I told him he was entitled to a lot of land and might select as John had mentioned. He accordingly at that time took such a piece as he chose, and the same has ever since been reserved for him in all the land contracts which I have made. On the 24th of August, 1817, I leased to Micah Brooks and Jellis Clute the whole of my original reservation except 4,000 acres and Thomas Clute's lot. Finding their title still incomplete on account of the United States government and Seneca chiefs not having sanctioned my acts, they solicited me to renew the contract and have the conveyance made to them in such a manner as they should thereby be constituted sole proprietors of the soil. In the winter of 1822 to 23, I agreed with them that if they would get the chiefs of our nation and a United States Commissioner of Indian Lands to meet in a consul at Moscow, Livingston County, New York, and there concur in my agreement, that I would sell to them all my right and title to the Gardeau Reservation, with the exception of a tract for my own benefit 2 miles long and 1 mile wide, lying on the river where I should choose it, and also reserving Thomas Clute's lot. This arrangement was agreed upon, and the council assembled at the place appointed on the 3rd or 4th day of September, 1823. That council consisted of Major Carroll, who had been appointed by the president to dispose of my lands, Judge Howell, and N. Gorham of Canandaigua, who acted in concert with Major Carroll, Jasper Parrish, Indian agent, Horatio Jones, interpreter, and a great number of chiefs. The bargain was assented to unanimously, and a deed was given to H.B. Gibson, Micah Brooks, and Jellis Clute of the whole Gardeau tract, excepting the last mentioned reservations, which was signed by myself and upwards of 20 chiefs. The land which I now own is bounded as follows. Beginning at the center of the Great Slide of the bank of Genesee River is a curiosity worthy of the attention of the traveler. In the month of May, 1817, a portion of land thickly covered with timber, situated at the upper end of the Gardeau Flats on the west side of the river, all of a sudden gave way and with a tremendous crash slid into the bed of the river, which it so completely filled that the stream formed a new passage on the east side of it, where it continues to run without overflowing the slide. This slide, as it now lies, contains 22 acres and has a considerable share of the timber that formerly covered it, still standing erect upon it and growing. In consideration of the above sale, the purchasers have bound themselves, their heirs, assigns, etc., to pay to me, my heirs or successors, $300 a year forever. Whenever the land which I have reserved shall be sold, the income of it is to be equally divided among the members of the Seneca Nation without any reference to tribes or to families. Chapter 16. Conclusion. Review of her life. Reflections on the loss of liberty. Care she took to preserve her health. Indians abstaining in drinking after the French War. Care of their lives. General use of spirits. Her natural strength. Purchase of her first cow. Means by which she has been supplied with food. Suspicions of her having been a witch. Her constancy. Number of children, number living, their residence, and closing reflection. When I review my life, the privations that I have suffered, the hardships I have endured, the vicissitudes I have passed, and the complete revolution that I have experienced in my manner of living, when I consider my reduction from a civilized to a savage state, and the various steps by which that process has been effected, and that my life has been prolonged and my health and reason spared, it seems a miracle that I am unable to account for, and is a tragical medley that I hope will never be repeated. The bare loss of liberty is but a mere trifle when compared with the circumstances that necessarily attend and are inseparably connected with it. It is the recollection of what we once were, of the friends, the home, and the pleasures that we have left or lost, the anticipation of misery, the appearance of wretchedness, the anxiety for freedom, the hope of release, the devising of means of escaping, and the vigilance with which we watch our keepers, that constitute the nauseous dregs of the bitter cup of slavery. I am sensible, however, that no one can pass from a state of freedom to that of slavery, and in the last situation rest perfectly contented. But as everyone knows that great exertions of the mind tend directly to debilitate the body, it will appear obvious that we ought, when confined, to exert all of our faculties to promote our present comfort, and let future days provide their own sacrifices in regard to ourselves, just as we feel we are. For the preservation of my life to the present time, I am indebted to an excellent constitution, with which I have been blessed in as a great degree as any other person. After I arrived to years of understanding, the care of my own health was one of my principal studies, and by avoiding exposures to wet and cold, by temperance in eating, abstaining from the use of spirits, and shunning the excesses to which I was frequently exposed, I effected my object beyond what I expected. I have never once been sick till within a year or two, only as I have related. Spirits and tobacco I have never used, and I have never once attended an Indian frolic. When I was taken prisoner, and for some time after that, spirits were not known, and when it was first introduced, it was in small quantities and used only by the Indians, so that it was a long time before the Indian women began to even taste it. After the French War, for a number of years, it was the practice of the Indians of our tribe to send to Niagara and get 2 or 3 kegs of rum, in all 6 or 8 gallons, and then they would hold a frolic as long as it lasted. When the rum was brought to the town, all the Indians collected, and before a drop was drank, gave all their knives, tomahawks, guns, and other instruments of war to one Indian, whose business it was to bury them in a very private place, keep them concealed, and remain perfectly sober till the frolic was ended. Having thus divested themselves, they commenced drinking, and continued their frolic till every last drop was consumed. If any of them became quarrelsome or got to fighting, those who were sober enough bound them upon the ground, where they were obliged to lie until they got sober, and then they were unbound. When the fumes of the spirits had left the company, the sober Indian returned to each the instruments with which they had entrusted him, and all of them went home satisfied. A frolic of that kind was held but once a year, and that at the time the Indians quit their hunting and come in with their deerskins. In those frolics, the women never participated. Soon after the Revolutionary War, however, spirits became common in our tribe and has been used indiscriminately by both sexes, though there are not so frequent instances of intoxication among the squaws as amongst the Indians. To the introduction and use of that baneful article, which has made such devastation in our tribes and threatens the extinction of our people, the Indians, I can with the greatest propriety impute the whole of my misfortune in losing my 3 sons. But as I have before observed, not even the love of life will restrain an Indian from sipping the poison that he knows will destroy him. The voice of nature, the rebukes of reason, the advice of parents, the expostulations of friends, and the numerous instances of sudden death are all insufficient to reclaim an Indian who has once experienced the exhilarating and inebriating effects of spirits from seeking his grave in the bottom of his bottle. My strength has been great for a woman of my size. Otherwise, I must long ago have died under the burdens with which I was obliged to carry. I learned to carry loads on my back in a strap placed across my forehead soon after my captivity, and continue to carry in the same way. Upwards of 30 years ago, with the help of my young children, I backed all the boards that were used about my house from Allen's mill at the outlet of Silver Lake, a distance of 5 miles. I have planted, hoed, and harvested corn every season but one since I was taken prisoner. Even this present fall, 1823, I have husked my corn and backed it into the house. The first cow that I ever owned, I bought of a squaw sometime after the Revolution. It had been stolen from the enemy. I had owned it but only a few days when it fell into a hole and almost died before we could get it out. After this, the squaw wanted to be recanted, but as I would not give up the cow, I gave her money enough to make, when added to the sum which I paid her at first, $35. Cows were plenty on the Ohio when I lived there, and of good quality. For provisions, I have never suffered since I came upon the flats, nor have I ever been in debt to any other hands than my own for the plenty that I have shared. My vices that have been suspected have been but very few. It was believed for a long time by some of our people that I was a great witch, but they were unable to prove my guilt, and consequently I escaped the certain doom of those who are convinced of that crime, which by Indians is considered as heinous as murder. Some of my children had light brown hair and tolerable fair skin, which used to make some say that I stole them. Yet as I was ever conscious of my own constancy, I never thought that anyone really believed that I was guilty of adultery. I have been the mother of 8 children, 3 of whom are now living, and I have at this time 39 grandchildren and 14 great-grandchildren, all living in the neighborhood of Genesee River and at Buffalo. I live in my own house and on my own land with my youngest daughter, Polly, who is married to George Chongo and has 3 children. My daughter, Nancy, who is married to Billy Green, lives about 80 rods south of my house and has 7 children. My other daughter, Betsy, is married to John Green, has 7 children, and resides 80 rods north of my house. Thus situated in the midst of my children, I expect I shall soon leave the world and make room for the rising generation. I feel the weight of years with which I am loaded, and am sensible of my daily failure in seeing, hearing, and strength. But my only anxiety is for my family. If my family will live happily, and I can be exempted from trouble while I have to stay, I feel as though I could lay down in peace a life that has been checked in almost every hour, with troubles of a deeper dye than are commonly experienced by mortals. And that concludes the narrative of Mary Jemison. I hope you enjoyed that reading. And I thank you for tuning in. Bye.